Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight we explore the history of computers. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. Long before electricity hummed through wires or silicon chips processed information at incomprehensible speeds, humanity grappled with a fundamental challenge: how to calculate, how to count, how to manage the growing complexity of numbers that accompanied civilization itself. The story of computers begins not in laboratories or universities, but in the markets and temples of ancient Mesopotamia, where merchants and priests needed to track grain stores, plot astronomical movements, and record transactions that sustained early cities. The abacus emerged from this necessity sometime around 2400 BCE, though its exact origins remain obscured by time. This deceptively simple device, consisting of beads sliding along rods or wires within a frame, represented humanity's first attempt to externalize the process of calculation. In the hands of a skilled operator, an abacus could perform addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division with remarkable speed. The device spread across trade routes, evolving into distinct forms: the Chinese swanpan with its 2 beads above the dividing bar and 5 below, the Japanese soroban with its more streamlined configuration, and the Roman abacus with its grooved tablets and movable counters. Each culture adapted the fundamental concept to its own mathematical systems and needs. What made the abacus revolutionary was not merely its ability to compute, but its role as an extension of human thought, a physical manifestation of abstract numerical relationships that could be manipulated, shared, and taught. For millennia, mechanical aids to calculation remained relatively simple. The human mind, supplemented by counting boards, tally sticks, and various forms of the abacus, managed the computational needs of even sophisticated civilizations. But as European society grew more complex during the Renaissance and early modern period, the limitations of manual calculation became increasingly apparent. Astronomers tracking planetary motions, navigators plotting courses across oceans, merchants managing international trade networks, and governments administering growing bureaucracies all required calculations of mounting complexity and volume. Errors in these calculations could mean lost ships, financial ruin, or flawed scientific theories. The stage was set for mechanical computation to evolve beyond simple counting devices. In 1642, a 19-year-old French mathematician named Blaise Pascal constructed a machine that would point toward a new future. His father, a tax commissioner, spent long hours performing tedious arithmetic, and Pascal sought to ease this burden. The result was the Pascaline, a brass and wood device that could add and subtract through an ingenious system of interlocking gears and wheels. When a wheel completed a full rotation from 9 back to 0, it automatically advanced the next wheel by 1 position, mechanizing the concept of carrying in addition. Pascal's machine was not merely a faster abacus, it was an attempt to embed the logic of arithmetic into the physical arrangement of components. Though expensive to produce and limited in its commercial success, the Pascaline demonstrated that calculation could be automated through mechanical means. 3 decades later, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German polymath, who would independently develop calculus alongside Isaac Newton, created a more sophisticated machine. His stepped reckoner, constructed around 1674, could perform all 4 basic arithmetic operations through an innovative cylinder with teeth of varying lengths. This step drum would become a fundamental component in calculating machines for the next 2 centuries. Leibniz envisioned something grander than a mere calculator. He imagined machines that could manipulate not just numbers, but logical propositions themselves. a dream that would not be fully realized for hundreds of years. Yet his work established a crucial principle. Complex operations could be broken down into sequences of simpler mechanical actions. The 19th century brought industrialization, and with it an explosion in the need for accurate tables. Logarithmic tables for scientific calculation, actuarial tables for insurance companies, navigational tables for naval operations, astronomical tables for predicting celestial events. These tables were computed by hand, often by rooms full of human computers, typically women, who performed repetitive calculations for hours on end. The process was tedious, expensive, and prone to error. A single mistake could propagate through subsequent calculations, rendering entire tables unreliable. Into this landscape stepped Charles Babbage, a British mathematician and inventor who would conceive of machines far beyond anything that had come before. In 1821, examining a table of astronomical calculations riddled with errors, Babbage reportedly exclaimed to a colleague that he wished these calculations could be executed by steam. This wish would consume much of his life and fortune. His first major design, the difference engine, was intended to calculate and print mathematical tables by the method of finite differences, eliminating human error from the process. The British government funded its construction, but the project exceeded the manufacturing capabilities of the era. The precision required for thousands of interlocking parts pushed contemporary metalworking to its limits. Undeterred by this setback, Babbage conceived something even more ambitious, the analytical engine. Designed in 1837, but never completed in his lifetime, this machine represented a conceptual leap of staggering proportions. Unlike the difference engine, which was designed for a specific mathematical purpose, the analytical engine was intended as a general-purpose computing device. It featured separate units for processing and memory, concepts that would later be called the mill and the store. It could be programmed through punched cards, borrowing the technology from the jacquard loom, which used such cards to control the weaving of complex patterns in fabric. Most remarkably, the analytical engine incorporated conditional branching, the ability to alter its sequence of operations based on intermediate results. This meant the machine could make decisions, could follow different paths through its program depending on what it discovered through calculation. Working alongside Babbage was Ada Lovelace, daughter of the poet Lord Byron and a mathematician of considerable insight. In 1843, she translated and extensively annotated an article about the analytical engine, and in these notes she went further than Babbage himself had publicly ventured. Lovelace recognized that such a machine might manipulate not only numbers, but any symbols that could be given logical meaning. She sketched out what is now recognized as the first computer algorithm, a method for calculating Bernoulli numbers using the analytical engine. Her vision extended beyond calculation to the possibility of machines creating music or art, provided these could be expressed in logical terms. The analytical engine was never built. The technology of the age could not support Babbage's vision, and funding dried up. Yet the concepts he and Lovelace articulated, the architecture of a programmable machine with memory, processing capability, and conditional logic, would lie dormant but not forgotten, waiting for an era when precision manufacturing and electrical engineering could finally bring such ideas into physical reality. As the 19th century drew to a close, the United States faced a peculiar crisis born of its own success. The Constitution mandated a census every 10 years to apportion representation in Congress, but the nation's explosive growth was overwhelming the manual methods used to tabulate results. The 1880 census had taken nearly 8 years to process completely, and officials projected that the 1890 census might not be finished before the 1900 count began. The country was in danger of losing the ability to understand its own population, its demographics, its economic patterns. A solution was needed, and it would come not from mathematics or engineering alone, but from an insight about how information itself could be mechanized. Herman Hollerith, a young engineer who had worked on the 1880 census, recognized that the problem was not calculation, but data processing. The census collected vast amounts of information, each person represented by dozens of characteristics: age, occupation, place of birth, literacy, and more. Hollerith's breakthrough was to represent each person as a pattern of holes punched into a card, with each position on the card corresponding to a specific attribute. His electric tabulating machine could then read these cards by passing metal pins through the holes, completing electrical circuits that advanced mechanical counters. When a pin found a hole, current flowed, and the appropriate counter clicked forward by one. The system could sort and count information at unprecedented speeds, reducing what had been months of manual tabulation to hours of mechanical processing. The 1890 census, processed using Hollerith's machines, was completed in just 2.5 years, despite the population having grown substantially. This success transformed not only government administration, but the very concept of information management. Hollerith founded a company to commercialize his invention, and businesses quickly recognized its potential. Insurance companies used the machines to analyze policy data, railroads to track freight shipments, department stores to manage inventory. The punched card became a standard medium for storing and processing data, a position it would hold for more than half a century. Hollerith's company would eventually merge with others to form International Business Machines, known more familiarly as IBM, which would dominate business computing for generations. The punched card systems represented a fundamental shift in thinking about information. Data became something that could be stored in physical form, separate from the human minds that created or interpreted it. It could be sorted, merged, duplicated, and processed through mechanical means. This externalization of information laid groundwork for more sophisticated developments, but it also began to change how organizations functioned. Bureaucracies could now manage larger populations, corporations could coordinate more complex operations, and governments could exert administrative control over territories and citizens with greater precision. The social implications of mechanical data processing were profound, though they unfolded gradually and often invisibly. While punched card systems automated data handling, the need for complex calculation continued to grow. Scientists and engineers working on problems in ballistics, structural analysis, and electrical engineering found themselves limited by the speed of manual computation. The early 20th century saw development of specialized analog computers, machines that represented numbers through continuous physical quantities rather than discrete symbols. Vannevar Bush at MIT constructed the differential analyzer in 1931, a room-sized machine that used rotating shafts, gears, and wheel and disc integrators to solve differential equations. These equations, which describe how quantities change in relation to one another, were essential for understanding everything from the stress on bridge cables to the trajectory of artillery shells. The differential analyzer could solve in hours what might take weeks of manual calculation, and multiple institutions built versions of the machine for their own research needs. Analog computers had inherent limitations, though. Their accuracy was constrained by mechanical precision, and they were difficult to reprogram for different problems. Yet they served vital roles, and throughout World War II, analog fire control computers calculated gun aimings on warships, continuously adjusting for target motion, wind, and the ship's own movement. These specialized machines demonstrated that computation could happen in real time, responding to changing conditions faster than any human operator. The interwar period also saw theoretical developments that would prove crucial for digital computing. In 1936, a young British mathematician named Alan Turing published a paper that explored the fundamental limits of computation. Turing imagined an abstract machine, now called a Turing machine, consisting of an infinite tape divided into cells, a read-write head that could move along the tape, and a simple set of rules determining the machine's behavior based on what symbol it read. This imaginary device could theoretically compute anything that was computable, given enough time and tape. More importantly, Turing demonstrated that a universal machine could be constructed, one that could simulate any other Turing machine if given an appropriate description of it. This concept of a universal computer, a single machine capable of performing any calculation if properly programmed, would become foundational to modern computing. Around the same time, Claude Shannon, working on his master's thesis at MIT, recognized that Boolean algebra, the mathematical logic of true and false statements, could be implemented using electrical switches. A switch could represent a 1 when closed and a 0 when open. Combinations of switches could perform AND, OR, and NOT OR logical operations. Shannon's insight meant that complex logical reasoning could be embedded in circuits of relays or other switching elements. This marriage of logic and electronics provided the theoretical foundation for digital circuit design. As the 1930s progressed toward global conflict, computational needs intensified. Military applications drove innovation, as they so often do. Germany developed cipher machines like the Enigma to protect military communications, creating encrypted messages that seemed unbreakable through conventional means. Breaking such codes required analyzing vast numbers of possible key settings, a task beyond human capability, but potentially within reach of machines. The stage was set for computing to move from the realm of business data processing and scientific calculation into the urgent world of cryptanalysis and military intelligence. The theoretical groundwork had been laid, the electromechanical technology was mature, and the desperate circumstances of approaching war would push development forward at an accelerated pace. Computing was about to enter a new phase, one where electronic switching would replace mechanical relays, and where machines would begin to operate at speeds that made new kinds of problems tractable. The Second World War transformed computing from a specialized scientific pursuit into a matter of national survival. Across the Atlantic, in a Victorian mansion called Bletchley Park, the British government assembled mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, and crossword puzzle enthusiasts for a singular purpose: breaking the codes that protected German military communications. The Enigma machine, with its rotating wheels and plugboard, could scramble messages in ways that created billions of possible key settings. Finding the correct setting for each day's messages through manual analysis was virtually impossible, but the British had advantages. Polish cryptanalysts had provided crucial insights into Enigma's workings before the war, and the Germans, confident in their cipher's security, followed predictable patterns that created weaknesses. Alan Turing, whose theoretical work on computation had been abstract and mathematical, now applied his mind to the concrete problem of mechanizing cryptanalysis. He designed a machine called the Bomber, an electromechanical device that could test thousands of possible Enigma settings rapidly by exploiting logical contradictions. When a contradiction appeared, that setting could be eliminated. The Bomber was not a general-purpose computer, but a specialized code-breaking tool, yet it demonstrated how machines could perform logical inference at speeds no human team could match. By war's end, over 200 bombs were operating, processing intercepted messages and providing intelligence that influenced everything from convoy routing to invasion planning. But the Germans had more sophisticated encryption systems than Enigma. The Lorenz cipher, used for high-level strategic communications between Hitler and his generals, was far more complex. Breaking Lorenz required different approaches, and at Bletchley Park, engineer Tommy Flowers led the development of Colossus, a machine that would mark a fundamental threshold in computing history. Colossus, completed in December 1943 and operational by February 1944, was the world's first large-scale electronic digital computer. It used vacuum tubes, glass bulbs containing heated filaments that could switch electronic signals on and off far faster than any mechanical relay. The first Colossus contained over 1,500 vacuum tubes, later versions more than 2,000. These tubes allow Colossus to process 5,000 characters per second, reading long paper tapes containing intercepted cipher text and testing them against possible wheel patterns of the Lorenz machine. The existence of Colossus remained secret for decades after the war, its achievements classified so deeply that even most participants in its development could not speak of their work, but its impact on the war effort was substantial. Intelligence derived from broken Lorenz messages provided the Allies with insight into German strategic thinking, resource allocation, and defensive preparations. The machine demonstrated that electronic switching could be reliable enough for serious computation despite the fragility of vacuum tubes, which burned out regularly and had to be replaced. This practical validation of electronic computing would influence post-war developments, though the secrecy meant its lessons had to be relearned independently by others. Across the Atlantic, American computing efforts followed different trajectories. At the University of Pennsylvania's Moore School of Electrical Engineering, a project began in 1943 to build an electronic machine for calculating artillery firing tables. The Ballistic Research Laboratory needed tables showing the trajectory of shells under varying conditions of elevation, charge, wind, and air density. Computing these tables manually was labour-intensive, and existing mechanical calculators were too slow for the wartime demand. John Mauchly and J. Presper Eckert proposed an electronic solution, and the Army funded what would become ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. ENIAC dwarfed Colossus in scale and ambition. When completed in November 1945, too late to contribute to the war it was designed for, ENIAC contained over 17,000 vacuum tubes, weighed 30 tons, and consumed 150 kilowatts of power. It could perform 5,000 additions per second, far exceeding the speed of any previous calculator. Unlike Colossus, which was specialized for cryptanalysis, ENIAC was designed for general numerical computation. However, programming it was extraordinarily laborious. The machine was programmed by physically reconfiguring cables and switches, a process that could take days for complex problems. Once programmed, though, ENIAC could execute calculations with breathtaking speed. Problems that would have taken weeks of manual computation could be solved in hours. The team operating ENIAC included 6 women, mathematicians who had previously worked as human computers, and who now became the first programmers of this electronic machine. Betty Snyder, Marlin Westkoff, Ruth Lichterman, Kay McNulty, Francis Bylas, and Betty Jean Jennings learned the machine's operation, devised programming techniques, and debugged both hardware and logical errors. Their work was initially unrecognized, classified as mere operation of equipment rather than the intellectual achievement it truly represented. But they were pioneering a new discipline, the art of instructing machines through logical sequences of operations. While ENIAC was under construction, discussions began about its successor. John von Neumann, a brilliant Hungarian-American mathematician who consulted on the ENIAC project, synthesized ideas from various sources into a coherent architecture for future computers. The key insight, elaborated in a draft report in 1945, was that a computer's program could be stored in the same memory as the data it operated on. Previous machines, including ENIAC, had separate mechanisms for program and data. Storing both together meant programs could be loaded quickly, modified by the computer itself, and treated as data for other programs. This stored program concept, which von Neumann articulated, but which drew on ideas from Turing, Eckert, Mauchly, and others, would become the fundamental architecture of nearly all subsequent computers. The wartime developments in computing were driven by urgent practical needs: breaking codes, computing ballistic tables, designing atomic weapons. Yet these projects produced machines and concepts that transcended their immediate military applications. They demonstrated that electronic computation was feasible, that machines could be general purpose rather than specialized, and that programs themselves could be treated as manipulable data. As the world transitioned from war to an uneasy peace, these lessons would be applied to civilian purposes. Computing was no longer a curiosity or a specialized tool for scientists. It was becoming a technology with broad implications for science, business, and eventually society itself. The question was no longer whether electronic computers would be built, but how they would develop and who would have access to their capabilities. The post-war years saw computing emerge from military secrecy into academic laboratories and eventually into the broader commercial world. Universities and research institutions recognized the potential of these electronic machines for scientific calculation. Manchester University in England completed the small-scale experimental machine, nicknamed Baby, in June 1948. Though it had limited memory and could perform only a handful of operations, Baby was the first stored program computer to run, executing its first program on June 21st. The program itself was simple, finding the highest proper divisor of a number through repeated subtraction, but the achievement was conceptual rather than computational. The program resided in the same electronic memory as the data, proving von Neumann's architecture in practice. Cambridge University developed EDSAC, the Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, which became operational in May 1949 and was the first practical stored program computer for general use. It employed mercury delay lines for memory, a technology that stored bits as ultrasonic pulses travelling through tubes of liquid mercury. When a pulse reached the end of a tube, it was detected, amplified, and re-injected at the beginning, creating a recirculating memory that could hold data as long as power remained on. This was neither elegant nor particularly reliable, but it worked, and EDSAC performed valuable scientific calculations for researchers across various disciplines. The question facing these early computing pioneers was not merely how to build machines, but how to make them useful to people who were not engineers. Programming in raw machine code, entering sequences of binary numbers representing operations and memory addresses was tedious and error-prone. Maurice Wilkes, director of the Cambridge laboratory that built EDSAC, developed one of the first assembly languages, allowing programmers to use mnemonic codes like ADD or STORE instead of numeric operation codes. This was a small step toward making programming more accessible, but it represented an important principle. Computers could be made more useful by building layers of abstraction between the human programmer and the machine's physical operation. As universities explored computing's scientific potential, businesses began to recognize commercial opportunities. The J. Lyons Company, a British restaurant and hotel chain, might seem an unlikely computing pioneer, but the firm had always embraced management innovations. Company executives, visiting American installations to observe business computing, recognized that computers could transform how large organizations managed information. Lyons commissioned Leo, the Lyons Electronic Office, which began handling the company's bakery valuations in November 1951, making it the first computer used for commercial business applications. Leo calculated costs, managed inventory, and performed payroll processing, demonstrating that computers could handle the routine but voluminous data processing that characterized modern business operations. In the United States, Remington Rand delivered the first UNIVAC, the Universal Automatic Computer, to the Census Bureau in March 1951. UNIVAC was designed by Eckert and Mauchly, who had left academia to form their own company, which Remington Rand later acquired. The machine gained public fame in November 1952 when CBS used a UNIVAC to predict the presidential election results. Based on early returns, the computer projected a landslide victory for Eisenhower over Stevenson, a prediction that seemed so implausible that CBS initially withheld it, fearing error. When Eisenhower's decisive victory materialized as predicted, UNIVAC became a symbol of the computer age to the American public, a mysterious electronic brain that could foresee the future through calculation. IBM, having hesitated to enter the commercial computer market, now moved decisively to dominate it. The company introduced the IBM 701 in 1952, initially planning to build perhaps 20 machines. Instead, IBM sold over 1,000, establishing itself as the leading computer manufacturer. IBM's success came not just from technical excellence, but from understanding that selling computers required supporting customers with maintenance, training, and software. The company cultivated relationships with businesses and governments, providing complete solutions rather than just hardware. This approach would make IBM synonymous with business computing for decades. Yet even as these first-generation computers began to proliferate, their fundamental technology was being superseded. Vacuum tubes, the heart of electronic switching in these machines, were bulky, consumed substantial power, generated tremendous heat, and failed frequently. A computer like UNIVAC might have its tubes fail at a rate of 1 per day, requiring constant maintenance. The solution came from solid-state physics and the semiconductor industry. At Bell Laboratories in December 1947, John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley demonstrated the transistor, a solid-state device that could amplify or switch electronic signals without vacuum tubes' limitations. The transistor relied on the properties of semiconductors, materials like silicon or germanium, whose electrical conductivity fell between insulators and conductors. By introducing impurities into semiconductor crystals in carefully controlled ways, regions could be created with excess electrons or deficit of electrons, called N-type and P-type semiconductors, respectively. A transistor consisted of 3 layers of semiconductor material, either NPN or PNP configuration. A small voltage applied to the middle layer could control a much larger current flowing between the outer layers, providing amplification. More importantly for computing, transistors could switch on and off, representing the ones and zeros of binary logic. The transistor was smaller than a vacuum tube, consumed a tiny fraction of the power, generated minimal heat, and could switch much faster. Early transistors were unreliable and expensive, but steady refinement improved both characteristics. By the mid-1950s, transistorized computers began to appear. The Tradic, built for the United States Air Force, became the first transistorized computer in 1954, containing only 800 transistors, but demonstrating the feasibility of the approach. The University of Manchester completed the transistor computer in November 1953, another early transistorized machine that pointed toward the future. The transition from vacuum tubes to transistors marked more than just a technological substitution. It enabled computers to become smaller, more reliable, and less expensive to operate. This opened computing to organizations that could not have afforded or housed the room-sized, power-hungry machines of the first generation. Universities, medium-sized businesses, and government agencies could now consider acquiring computers. The technology was still expensive and required specialized knowledge to operate, but it was becoming more accessible. As the 1950s progressed, computing began its transformation from an exotic tool used by a few large organizations to a technology with potential for much broader application. The question was shifting from whether computers would be useful to how they would be integrated into the fabric of modern society. The 1960s brought a new phase in computing's evolution, one defined not merely by faster machines, but by fundamental changes in how computers were conceived and used. Transistors had made computers more reliable and compact, but assembling thousands of individual transistors, resistors, capacitors, and the wiring connecting them remained labor-intensive and prone to failure at connection points. The solution emerged from an insight about manufacturing. If multiple components could be fabricated together on a single piece of semiconductor material, the reliability problems of discrete components and their connections could be largely eliminated. Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor independently developed the integrated circuit in 1958 and 1959. Kilby's initial device was crude, with components formed on germanium and connected by external wires, but it demonstrated the principle. Noyce's approach, using silicon and depositing metal connections directly onto the chip surface, proved more practical for manufacturing. An integrated circuit, or microchip, contained multiple transistors and other components formed through photographic and chemical processes on a thin wafer of silicon. Early integrated circuits might contain only a few dozen components, but the technology improved rapidly. By the mid-60s, chips containing hundreds of components were common, and the trajectory toward greater complexity was clear. Integrated circuits transformed computing economics. Computers became smaller, consumed less power, and cost less to manufacture and maintain. IBM's System 360, announced in April 1964, represented a watershed in commercial computing. Rather than offering incompatible machines for different purposes, IBM created a family of computers sharing the same instruction set architecture, but varying in size and performance. A program written for a smaller System 360 could run on a larger model without modification, protecting customers' software investments as their needs grew. This compatibility across a product line was revolutionary, and System 360's success was extraordinary. By 1966, over half of all computers in use worldwide were IBM machines, and the System 360 dominated the mainframe market. Mainframes, as these large centralized computers were called, became the heart of organizational computing. Banks used them to process transactions and maintain accounts, airlines to manage reservation systems, manufacturers to track inventory and control production, governments to administer social programs and collect taxes. These machines operated continuously, handling workloads from multiple departments or users. The concept of time-sharing emerged, allowing multiple users to interact with a single computer simultaneously through terminals. Each user received a slice of processing time in rapid rotation, creating the illusion that the computer was responding to their commands alone. MIT's compatible time-sharing system, operational by 1961, and later Project Mac, demonstrated that interactive computing was not only possible, but fundamentally different from the batch processing model that had dominated. In batch processing, users submitted jobs, often as decks of punched cards, and waited hours or days for results. Time-sharing allowed programmers and researchers to interact with computers directly, typing commands and seeing responses within seconds. This interactivity accelerated learning and experimentation, making computers more accessible tools for thought rather than remote oracles that delivered pronouncements after lengthy delays. The growth of computing created an escalating demand for software. Early computers were programmed in machine language or assembly, languages closely tied to specific hardware. As computers proliferated and programs grew more complex, the need for higher-level programming languages became acute. Fortran, introduced by IBM in 1957, allowed programmers to write mathematical formulas in a notation resembling algebraic equations, with a compiler translating these into machine code. COBOL, developed around 1960, aimed at business data processing with English-like syntax for record manipulation. These languages made programming more accessible to non-specialists and made programs more portable across different machines. The 1960s saw an explosion of language development, each designed for different purposes or embodying different philosophies. Lisp, created by John McCarthy in 1958, treated computation as evaluation of symbolic expressions and became the dominant language for artificial intelligence research. BASIC, developed by John Kemeny and Thomas Kurtz at Dartmouth College in 1964, was designed for teaching programming to students without technical backgrounds, emphasizing simplicity and interactive use. Each language represented choices about how humans should communicate with machines, what operations should be primitive, and what kinds of problems the language should make easy to express. Software engineering emerged as a discipline distinct from hardware design. The NATO Software Engineering Conference in 1968 acknowledged a crisis. Software projects routinely exceeded budgets and schedules, delivered systems that failed to meet requirements, or simply failed altogether. As programs grew from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of lines of code, managing complexity became the central challenge. Structured programming techniques, advocated by Edsger Dijkstra and others, emphasize clarity of logic flow, modular design, and systematic testing. The recognition that programming was an engineering discipline requiring rigorous methods marked a maturation of the field. Beyond business and science, computing began to influence culture and raise questions about society's future. Computers appeared in popular imagination as both promise and threat. Science fiction explored scenarios of artificial intelligence, while skeptics warned of dehumanization and unemployment. The reality was more prosaic but equally profound. Computers were becoming embedded in the infrastructure of modern life. Air traffic control systems managed increasingly crowded skies. Telephone networks used computers to route calls, and power grids employed automated control systems. These systems mostly worked invisibly, noticed only when they failed, but they represented a quiet transformation in how complex technical systems were managed. Research laboratories explored directions that seemed speculative, but would later prove consequential. Douglas Engelbart's Augmentation Research Center at Stanford Research Institute investigated how computers could amplify human intellectual capability. In December 1968, Engelbart gave a demonstration that previewed personal computing's future. He showed a computer system with a mouse, windows, hypertext, and real-time collaborative editing, all concepts that seemed radical at a time when most computing was batch-oriented mainframe processing. The demonstration was received with amazement, but the technology was far from ready for widespread adoption. Similarly, early work on computer networks began, driven initially by military interests in creating robust communication systems. The Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, ARPANET, made its first connection between UCLA and Stanford Research Institute in October 1969, transmitting the word login, though the system crashed after just the first two letters. This humble beginning would eventually evolve into the Internet, but in the late 60s, networking remained an experimental pursuit, its transformative potential not yet evident. Computing in this era was still primarily about centralized mainframes serving organizational needs. The personal computer revolution and the networked world it would enable lay just beyond the horizon. The integrated circuit's density continued to increase throughout the late 1960s, following a pattern Gordon Moore had observed in 1965. The number of components that could be economically placed on a chip roughly doubled every year, later revised to every 2 years. This exponential growth, known as Moore's law, was not a law of nature, but a self-fulfilling prophecy, an industry goal that drove investment and innovation. By 1970, chips containing thousands of transistors were feasible, raising a question that seemed almost absurd. Could an entire computer's central processing unit be fabricated on a single chip? Intel, a young company founded by Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, pursued this possibility not for computers per se, but for a Japanese calculator manufacturer called Busicom. Rather than designing separate custom chips for each calculator model, Intel engineer Ted Hoff proposed a general-purpose processor that could be programmed for different functions. The result, introduced in November 1971, was the Intel 4004, the first commercial microprocessor. It contained 2,300 transistors on a chip smaller than a thumbnail and could execute 60,000 operations per second. By modern standards, it was primitive, processing data in 4-bit chunks and addressing limited memory, but it represented a conceptual breakthrough. An entire computer processor, the calculating and control heart of a machine, could now be mass-produced as an inexpensive component. The 4004 and its successors, like the 8-bit Intel 8080, were initially used in embedded applications: traffic lights, instrument controllers, industrial equipment. But hobbyists and engineers recognized that these chips could be the foundation for small, affordable computers that individuals might own. The January 1975 issue of Popular Electronics featured the Altair 8800 on its cover, a kit computer built around the Intel 8080 microprocessor. The Altair had no keyboard or display, just switches for input and lights for output, yet it sparked intense interest. Computer clubs formed, where enthusiasts shared programming techniques and hardware modifications. In Silicon Valley, the Homebrew Computer Club became a crucible for personal computing ideas, with members including Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, who would found Apple Computer, and many others who would shape the emerging industry. The notion that individuals might own computers was radical. Computing had been the province of large organizations with substantial budgets and technical staffs. A mainframe might cost millions of dollars and require specially prepared facilities. But microprocessors made it possible to build complete computers for hundreds or thousands of dollars, affordable for small businesses, schools, and eventually households. The challenge was making these machines useful to people without engineering backgrounds. Various companies introduced personal computers with keyboards, displays, and programming languages in built-in memory. The Commodore PET, the Tandy TRS-80, and the Apple II all appeared in 1977. The Apple II, designed by Steve Wozniak, proved particularly successful. It offered color graphics, expansion slots for adding capabilities, and a clean design that looked like a consumer appliance rather than a hobbyist's project. Importantly, it could run VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet program, introduced in 1979. VisiCalc transformed personal computers from intriguing toys into business tools. Accountants, financial analysts, and small business owners could perform complex calculations and explore what-if scenarios with immediate feedback, capabilities that had required either expensive mainframe time or tedious manual computation. Many people bought Apple IIs specifically to run VisiCalc, marking the first time software drove hardware sales. While personal computers captured public attention, the computing industry's economic center remained business data processing. IBM had viewed early personal computers as peripheral to its core market, but the company recognized it could not ignore this emerging segment. In August 1981, IBM introduced its personal computer, the IBM PC, built with off-the-shelf components including Intel's 16-bit 8088 microprocessor and an operating system called MS-DOS, licensed from a small company called Microsoft. IBM's entry legitimized personal computing for businesses. The IBM PC was not particularly innovative technically, but IBM's reputation and sales channels gave it instant credibility. Corporate purchasing departments, comfortable with IBM, were willing to buy PCs where they might have hesitated with other brands. IBM's decision to use standard components and publish the PC's technical specifications, intending to accelerate adoption, had an unintended consequence. Other manufacturers could build compatible machines, clone computers that ran the same software. Compaq produced the first successful IBM-compatible portable computer in 1983, and many other companies followed. The result was a competitive market that drove down prices and accelerated innovation. IBM itself became just one player in the PC market it had defined, and the real winners were Intel, whose processors became the standard, and Microsoft, whose operating system ran on every compatible machine. Microsoft's position in the personal computer ecosystem grew increasingly central. The company, founded by Bill Gates and Paul Allen in 1975, had begun by developing programming languages for early personal computers. The DOS operating system deal with IBM, signed when Microsoft was still a small firm, proved extraordinarily lucrative because Microsoft retained rights to license DOS to other manufacturers. As the PC-compatible market exploded, Microsoft's operating system became nearly ubiquitous on business computers. The company's strategy emphasized software's leverage. Developing a program required significant initial investment, but could be replicated and sold at minimal marginal cost. This economics favored companies that could achieve dominant market position. The personal computer's rise changed not just what computers could do, but who could use them. Early adopters included businesses seeking efficiency, schools trying to prepare students for a computerized future, and hobbyists exploring programming and electronics. But the vision of computing as a tool for personal creativity and productivity was becoming reality. Word processing eliminated retyping. Databases helped organize information, and games provided entertainment. Home computers like the Commodore 64, introduced in 1982 and eventually selling over 17 million units, brought computing into living rooms and dens, making the technology familiar to a generation of children. Yet this accessibility had limits. Operating these machines required learning commands, understanding file systems, and troubleshooting cryptic error messages. The interface between human and computer remained primarily textual, with users typing commands at a prompt. Research labs had explored graphical user interfaces, using pointing devices and visual metaphors like windows and icons. But these remained expensive curiosities, requiring processing power beyond what affordable personal computers offered. Xerox PARC Research Center had developed sophisticated graphical systems in the early 70s, and Apple had experimented with the Apple Lisa in 1983. But these machines cost nearly $10,000, far beyond most buyers' reach. The promise of truly intuitive personal computing, where the machine adapted to human expectations rather than requiring humans to think like machines, remained aspirational as the 1980s began. The technology was advancing rapidly, but making it genuinely accessible to everyone would require another set of breakthroughs. The transformation of computing from command-line complexity to intuitive interaction arrived in January 1984 with Apple's Macintosh. The machine, introduced through a dramatic Super Bowl advertisement, featured a graphical user interface where users manipulated virtual objects on screen using a mouse. Files appeared as icons resembling paper documents, folders organized them visually, and a trash can held deleted items. Users could point and click rather than memorize commands, drag items from place to place, and see documents on screen as they would appear when printed. This concept, called "what you see is what you get," or WYSIWYG, made desktop publishing accessible to non-specialists. The Macintosh drew heavily on research at Xerox PARC, where the Alto computer had pioneered graphical interfaces in the early 70s. Steve Jobs had visited PARC in 1979 and recognized the potential of these ideas for consumer products. The Macintosh made graphical computing affordable, though at nearly $2,500, it remained expensive. Early models had limited memory and application software, and businesses accustomed to IBM PCs were slow to adopt a machine incompatible with their existing software. Yet the Macintosh established principles of interface design that would eventually dominate personal computing: visual metaphors, direct manipulation, consistency across applications, and hiding technical complexity behind intuitive controls. Microsoft, watching Apple's success and the market's enthusiastic response to graphical interfaces, developed Windows, a graphical environment that ran atop DOS on IBM-compatible PCs. The first version in 1985 was crude and slow, offering overlapping windows but limited functionality. Windows 2.0 in 1987 improved performance, and Windows 3.0 in 1990 finally achieved commercial success, selling millions of copies. Windows 3.1, released in 1992, became the dominant operating environment for business PCs, benefiting from the vast installed base of IBM-compatible hardware and the lower cost of PC clones compared to Macintoshes. The competition between Apple's integrated approach, controlling both hardware and software, and Microsoft's strategy of licensing software to run on diverse hardware, would define decades of industry dynamics. Apple offered superior design and user experience, but commanded premium prices and limited market share. Microsoft's Windows achieved ubiquity through partnerships with numerous hardware manufacturers, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where developers wrote software for Windows because most users had Windows, and users chose Windows because most software ran on it. This network effect, where a product's value increases with the number of users, proved decisive in establishing Windows as the dominant platform for business and consumer computing through the 1990s. As personal computers proliferated, connecting them became increasingly important. Local area networks allowed computers in offices to share files and printers, reducing duplication and facilitating collaboration. Ethernet, developed at Xerox PARC in the 1970s and standardized in the early 80s, became the dominant networking technology. Cables connected computers to hubs or switches, creating shared communication channels. Network protocols defined how machines addressed each other and transmitted data reliably despite the possibility of collisions and errors. Beyond local networks, the academic and research network that had begun as ARPANET continued evolving. In 1983, ARPANET transitioned to TCP/IP, the Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol, which became the foundation for Internet working, connecting different networks into a unified system. TCP/IP broke messages into packets, small chunks of data with addressing information, and routed them through multiple intermediate computers to their destination, where they were reassembled. This design was robust, allowing packets to take different paths if parts of the network failed, and scalable, permitting networks of vastly different types to interconnect. Through the 80s, this internet remained primarily academic and governmental. Universities, research labs, and military installations connected to exchange email and transfer files. Email, which had existed since the early 70s, became increasingly important for professional communication, faster than postal mail and more convenient than telephone for non-urgent matters. Usenet newsgroups created discussion forums around specific topics, building communities of interest across geographic boundaries. Yet these services required technical knowledge to access, and the Internet's user base remained limited to those with institutional affiliations. Tim Berners-Lee, a British computer scientist working at CERN, the European Particle Physics Laboratory, recognised that researchers needed better ways to share information. In 1989, he proposed a system of interlinked documents that could be accessed through a simple client program. His World Wide Web combined several technologies: HTTP, a protocol for requesting and sending documents; HTML, a markup language for describing document structure and links; and URLs, unique addresses for each resource. The first web browser and server software ran in 1990, and Berners-Lee made the system available freely, not seeking to patent or commercialize it. The web's genius was its simplicity. Creating a web page required only writing text with simple formatting codes. Linking to other pages required including their URL. Browsers handled the complexity of network communication and document rendering, presenting users with a simple point-and-click interface. The web grew organically as individuals and organizations created pages and linked to others, forming an interconnected mesh of information without central coordination or control. In 1993, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications released Mosaic, a graphical web browser that ran on multiple platforms and made web browsing accessible to non-specialists. Mosaic displayed inline images within documents, a simple feature that transformed the web from a text-based medium into a visual one. Usage exploded. Websites proliferated, covering everything from academic research to personal hobbies to commercial products. Mark Andreessen, one of Mosaic's creators, founded Netscape Communications and released Netscape Navigator in late 1994. The browser was free for personal use and became phenomenally popular, dominating the market and introducing millions to the internet. The mid-90s saw commercialization transform the internet from an academic network into a mass medium. Internet service providers offered dial-up connections to households, letting home computers access the net through telephone lines. Though slow, typically 56 kilobits per second at best, these connections opened the internet to anyone with a computer and phone line. Businesses established web presences, initially simple brochure sites but increasingly sophisticated as e-commerce emerged. Amazon launched in 1995 as an online bookstore, eBay as an auction platform. The web was becoming not just an information medium, but a commercial marketplace. The internet's growth raised questions about governance, privacy, and social impact. Unlike broadcast media with limited channels controlled by governments or corporations, the internet allowed anyone to publish, creating unprecedented opportunities for free expression, but also challenges for content moderation and accuracy. The digital divide emerged as a concern, with affluent households gaining internet access, while poorer communities risked exclusion from the information economy. Encryption and privacy technologies clashed with law enforcement desires for surveillance capabilities. These tensions would intensify as the internet became more central to daily life, but in the mid-90s, the prevailing mood was optimistic, even utopian. The internet seemed to promise democratized information, global connectivity, and new forms of community transcending physical geography. Computing was no longer just about processing information, it was becoming about connecting people across the world in ways previously impossible. The late 1990s witnessed a speculative frenzy around internet-based businesses. Investors, convinced that the web represented a fundamental economic transformation, poured capital into companies with little more than domain names and business plans. Stock valuations soared to absurd levels based not on profits or revenue, but on metrics like page views and user growth. Traditional business fundamentals seemed obsolete in this new economy, where network effects and first-mover advantages supposedly guaranteed future dominance. Companies spent lavishly on advertising and customer acquisition, planning to monetize their user bases later once they achieved scale. The dot-com bubble burst in early 2000 when investors finally demanded profitability. Stock prices collapsed, companies failed by the hundreds, and billions in market value evaporated. Yet the correction, though painful, did not represent the internet's failure, but rather a reset to sustainable economics. Companies that survived, including Amazon and eBay, had genuine business models and operational efficiency. The infrastructure built during the boom, fiber optic networks and data centers, remained available at reduced cost. The crash cleared away unsustainable business models while preserving the technological foundation for continued growth. From the wreckage emerged companies that would define the next phase of internet development. Google, founded by Larry Page and Sergey Brin in 1998 while they were Stanford graduate students, approached search differently than predecessors. Instead of relying primarily on keyword matching, Google's PageRank algorithm analyzed the link structure of the web, treating links as votes of confidence. Pages linked to by many other pages ranked higher, especially if those linking pages were themselves highly ranked. This approach produced more relevant results than competing search engines, and Google's clean interface, free of the clutter that characterized portals like Yahoo, appealed to users. The company monetized search through text advertisements matched to query terms, creating an auction system where advertisers bid for placement. This model proved extraordinarily lucrative, generating revenue directly related to user intent without disrupting the search experience. Social networking emerged as another transformative application of internet technology. Early services like 6 Degrees and Friendster explored online social connections, but Facebook, launched in 2004 initially for Harvard students and expanding to other universities and eventually the general public, achieved unprecedented scale. Facebook's real name policy and emphasis on actual social relationships rather than anonymous interaction created a different dynamic from earlier online communities. Users shared photos, status updates, and links, creating a stream of content from friends and family. The service became a daily habit for hundreds of millions, then billions, fundamentally changing how people maintained relationships and consumed information. Twitter, launched in 2006, offered a different model. Public broadcasts limited to 140 characters, creating a real-time information network where news, commentary, and conversation flowed continuously. YouTube, also founded in 2005, enabled user-generated video content, democratizing video distribution and creating new forms of entertainment and education. These platforms collectively shifted the web from a read-only medium of published content to a participatory space where users created and shared as much as they consumed. Simultaneously, computing was becoming portable. Laptop computers had existed since the 1980s, but they remained expensive and heavy. As components miniaturized and battery technology improved, laptops became practical alternatives to desktops for many users. Wireless networking, standardized as Wi-Fi in the late 90s, freed computers from network cables, enabling use anywhere within range of an access point. Coffee shops, libraries, and airports offered internet access, and work became less tied to specific locations. The most profound shift toward mobile computing came with smartphones. Early mobile phones were just that, phones that happened to be mobile. PDAs, personal digital assistants like the Palm Pilot, offered computing capabilities but required separate devices for phone service. The convergence of these functions created the smartphone category. Research in Motion's BlackBerry devices, popular with business users in the early 2000s, combined email, phone, and messaging with physical keyboards designed for thumb typing. Apple's iPhone, introduced in June 2007, redefined the category. Its multi-touch screen eliminated the keyboard, allowing the interface to adapt to different applications. The device combined phone, music player, web browser, and camera in an elegant package controlled through intuitive gestures. Tap, swipe, pinch to zoom. The App Store, launched in 2008, created an ecosystem where third-party developers could distribute software, establishing smartphones as general-purpose computing platforms rather than appliances with fixed functions. Google's Android operating system, released around the same time and licensed freely to hardware manufacturers, provided an alternative platform that quickly gained market share through diversity of devices and price points. Smartphones transformed computing from something people did at desks to something they carried constantly. Mobile apps specialized for specific tasks, photography apps that rivaled dedicated cameras, navigation apps that replaced standalone GPS devices, messaging apps that created new forms of communication. The always connected, always accessible nature of smartphones changed social dynamics, as people could remain perpetually in contact with networks of friends and colleagues. Information became instantly available anywhere, but so did the expectation of constant availability and immediate response. Behind these user-facing developments, fundamental shifts were occurring in computing infrastructure. Companies like Amazon realized that the massive computing capacity they had built to handle peak shopping loads remained underutilized most of the time. Amazon Web Services, launched in 2006, offered computing resources as a service, allowing other companies to rent processors, storage, and networking on demand, rather than investing in their own data centers. This cloud computing model transformed IT economics, replacing capital expenditure on hardware with operational expenditure on services, and enabling startups to access enterprise-scale infrastructure without massive upfront investment. Cloud services meant computing power and storage were increasingly divorced from specific physical machines. Documents stored in the cloud could be accessed from any device. Applications ran on remote servers, with users interacting through web browsers or thin client applications. This model offered flexibility and accessibility, but raised concerns about privacy and control. Data residing on corporate servers was subject to surveillance, whether by governments or the companies themselves. Service outages could render applications inaccessible. Users traded autonomy for convenience, often without fully understanding the implications. The late 2000s also saw Moore's law approaching physical limits. Transistors could not shrink indefinitely. Quantum effects became significant at nanometer scales, and heat dissipation constrained clock speeds. Processor manufacturers responded by adding multiple cores to chips, allowing parallel processing rather than faster sequential execution. Software had to be redesigned to exploit this parallelism, a more complex programming model than simply running faster on next year's hardware. The era of easy performance gains through hardware advancement was ending, requiring more sophisticated approaches to continued improvement. By the end of the 2000s, computing had become ubiquitous in developed nations. Most adults carried smartphones, households had multiple computers, and internet connectivity was assumed. Computing was infrastructure, as fundamental to modern life as electricity or running water. The question was no longer whether computing would transform society, but how to manage the transformation's consequences. Privacy, in an age of pervasive data collection. Attention in an era of constant connectivity. Truth in a landscape of algorithmic content curation. These challenges would intensify in the coming decade as computing continued its evolution from tool to environment. The 2010s marked computing's maturation from tool to substrate, an underlying layer upon which modern life was increasingly built. Smartphones became more powerful than desktop computers of just years earlier, their processors containing billions of transistors executing trillions of instructions per second. High-speed mobile networks, fourth generation and then fifth, provided bandwidth rivaling home broadband connections. Computing was not merely ubiquitous, but invisible, embedded in objects and infrastructure that previously had no computational capacity. The Internet of Things connected everyday devices to networks, collecting data and enabling remote control. Thermostats learned household patterns and adjusted temperatures automatically. Fitness trackers monitored heart rates and activity levels. Home assistants responded to voice commands, playing music, answering questions, controlling lights and appliances. Automobiles contained dozens of computers managing everything from fuel injection to collision avoidance. This proliferation of network sensors generated vast quantities of data, streams of information about human behavior, environmental conditions, and system performance. Big data, the analysis of datasets too large for traditional database systems, became central to business and science. Companies tracked user behavior across websites and applications, building detailed profiles for targeted advertising. Retailers analyzed purchase patterns to optimize inventory and pricing. Scientists processed genomic data, climate models, and astronomical observations at scales previously impossible. The challenge was not merely storing enormous datasets, but extracting meaningful patterns from them, finding signal in the noise. Machine learning, a branch of artificial intelligence focused on systems that improve through experience rather than explicit programming, provided tools for big data analysis. Rather than writing rules for how to classify images or recognize speech, developers trained models on large datasets of examples. Neural networks, computational structures loosely inspired by biological brains, proved particularly effective. These networks consisted of layers of artificial neurons, simple processing units that received inputs, applied weights and activation functions, and produced outputs. Training adjusted the weights through a process called backpropagation, where errors in the network's predictions were used to modify connection strengths. Deep learning, using neural networks with many layers, achieved breakthroughs in problems that had resisted earlier approaches. In 2012, a deep learning system won an image recognition competition by a substantial margin, demonstrating convolutional neural networks' capability for visual understanding. Speech recognition improved dramatically, making voice interfaces practical for everyday use. Machine translation between languages became significantly more accurate. Gaming AI reached superhuman performance in complex games like Go, where the vast number of possible positions had seemed beyond computational reach. These advances required enormous computational resources. Training large neural networks demanded processing power measured in petaflops, quadrillions of floating-point operations per second, running for days or weeks. Graphics processing units, originally designed for rendering images in video games, proved well suited for the parallel mathematical operations machine learning required. Cloud providers offered specialized hardware, including tensor processing units optimized specifically for neural network computation. The environmental cost of this computation became a concern, as data centers consumed substantial electricity, often from fossil fuel sources. Artificial intelligence applications proliferated across domains. Medical diagnosis systems analyzed imaging studies and patient records, sometimes detecting conditions human physicians missed. Autonomous vehicles navigated roads using computer vision and sensor fusion. Recommendation algorithms suggested products, movies, and content, shaping what people saw and potentially creating filter bubbles where individuals encountered only information confirming existing beliefs. Credit scoring, hiring decisions, and criminal justice risk assessments increasingly relied on algorithmic systems, raising questions about fairness and accountability when these systems exhibited biases present in their training data. The nature of software development itself evolved. Open source collaboration, where programmers worldwide contributed to shared projects, produced sophisticated software systems like the Linux operating system and countless libraries and frameworks. GitHub, a platform for hosting and collaborating on code, became infrastructure for software development. Cloud-native architectures, where applications were built from small services communicating through APIs rather than monolithic programs, enabled rapid development and scaling. Containers like Docker packaged applications with their dependencies, ensuring consistent behavior across different computing environments. Cybersecurity grew increasingly critical as computing infrastructure became targets for criminal activity, espionage, and warfare. Ransomware encrypted users' files and demanded payment for decryption keys. Data breaches exposed personal information of millions. Nation-states conducted cyber operations against adversaries' critical infrastructure. The distributed nature of the Internet, once seen as resilience against failure, also meant no central authority could secure the system. Security required constant vigilance, patching vulnerabilities, monitoring for intrusions, and educating users about threats like phishing attacks. Privacy erosion accelerated as data collection became pervasive. Smartphones tracked locations continuously. Web browsing generated detailed profiles of interests and behavior. Social media posts created permanent records. This data enabled targeted advertising and personalized services, but also surveillance, whether by governments, employers, or intimate partners. Regulations like Europe's General Data Protection Regulation attempted to provide users control over their data, but the complexity of modern data flows made true informed consent difficult. Many users accepted extensive data collection as the price of free services, though research suggested most did not fully understand what they were agreeing to. Alongside practical advances, researchers pursued quantum computing, a fundamentally different computational paradigm. Classical computers represented information as bits, zeros, or ones. Quantum computers use qubits, quantum systems that could exist in superposition, simultaneously in multiple states until measured. This allowed quantum computers to explore many computational paths in parallel. Quantum algorithms promised exponential speed-ups for specific problems, factoring large numbers, searching unsorted databases, simulating quantum systems. However, building stable qubits was extraordinarily difficult. Quantum systems were fragile, easily disrupted by environmental noise, requiring near absolute zero temperatures and elaborate error correction. By the early 2020s, quantum computers with dozens of qubits existed in research labs, demonstrating quantum advantage for carefully chosen problems, but far from the thousands of error-corrected qubits needed for practical applications. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 demonstrated computing's centrality to modern society. As physical distancing became necessary, work, education, and social interaction moved online. Video conferencing tools enabled remote collaboration. Cloud services allowed distributed teams to access shared resources. Online platforms facilitated commerce when physical stores closed. Simultaneously, computing enabled scientific response. Genomic sequencing identified the virus and tracked variants. Modeling informed policy decisions, and computational biology accelerated vaccine development. The pandemic revealed both computing's enabling power and digital inequities, as those without reliable internet access faced significant disadvantages. As the 2020s progressed, computing stood at an inflection point. Hardware progress continued, but faced physical and economic limits. Software grew more sophisticated, but also more complex and potentially fragile. Artificial intelligence achieved impressive capabilities, but also raised profound questions about autonomy, bias, and societal impact. Computing had transformed from a specialized tool used by experts into infrastructure undergirding modern civilization, yet its future trajectory remained uncertain. The story of computing's next phase would depend on choices about values and priorities, not merely technical possibilities. Computing today exists in a state of remarkable achievement and profound uncertainty. The technology has progressed from mechanical calculators to pocket devices more powerful than room-sized mainframes, from isolated machines to a global network connecting billions of people, from specialized tools for experts to infrastructure woven through every aspect of modern life. Yet this success brings complex challenges that purely technical solutions cannot address, requiring instead careful consideration of values, trade-offs, and collective choices about the kind of future computing should enable. Artificial intelligence continues advancing rapidly, with large language models demonstrating abilities that seem to approach human-level performance on many linguistic and reasoning tasks. These models, trained on vast text corpora, can generate coherent prose, answer questions, write code, and engage in dialogue with remarkable fluency. Image generation systems create realistic or fantastical pictures from text descriptions, raising questions about creativity, authorship, and the nature of artistic expression. Yet these systems also exhibit concerning behaviors, generating plausible but false information, reflecting biases from training data, and lacking true understanding despite surface fluency. The question of whether artificial general intelligence, systems matching human cognitive flexibility across domains, will emerge remains open, with predictions ranging from imminent to impossible. The computational demands of advanced AI strain both infrastructure and environment. Training frontier models requires data centers full of specialized processors running for months, consuming megawatts of power and generating substantial carbon emissions. Inference, running trained models to serve user requests, multiplies these costs across billions of interactions. As AI capabilities improve and adoption spreads, the aggregate energy consumption threatens climate goals unless renewable energy sources scale commensurately. Some researchers explore efficient architectures and training methods, seeking to achieve comparable performance with reduced computational budgets, but the trend toward larger models and data sets continues. Quantum computing remains in early stages despite decades of research. Current quantum computers achieve quantum advantage on carefully constructed problems, but lack the error correction needed for practical applications. Researchers debate whether incremental progress will eventually yield useful devices or whether fundamental breakthroughs are necessary. If quantum computers do mature, they will threaten current encryption systems, many of which rely on the difficulty of factoring large numbers or solving discrete logarithm problems that quantum algorithms can efficiently solve. This has spurred development of post-quantum cryptography, encryption schemes believed resistant to quantum attack, which governments and institutions are beginning to deploy preemptively. Edge computing pushes processing toward the network's periphery rather than centralizing it in distant data centers. Smart devices, sensors, and embedded systems perform local computation, reducing latency and bandwidth requirements while raising privacy by keeping data local. Autonomous vehicles process sensor data on board, rather than streaming everything to remote servers. Industrial systems control manufacturing processes locally while coordinating globally. This distributed architecture combines cloud computing scale with edge devices responsiveness, though it complicates system design and security. Augmented and virtual reality technologies seek to overlay digital information on physical environments or create immersive synthetic worlds. Applications range from entertainment to education to industrial training, allowing people to visualize complex data, practice procedures safely, or collaborate despite physical separation. Yet adoption has been slower than enthusiasts predicted, limited by hardware costs, comfort issues, and unclear compelling use cases for everyday users. Whether these technologies remain niche tools or become ubiquitous computing platforms depends on continued hardware improvement and development of applications that justify the investment. Biological computing explores using living systems for computation, engineering bacteria or neurons to process information. DNA computing stores data in genetic sequences, offering extraordinary density if read and write speeds improve. Neuromorphic computing builds hardware mimicking biological neural networks' efficiency and architecture. These approaches remain largely experimental, but suggest computing need not be limited to silicon electronics. The boundary between biological and artificial intelligence may blur as understanding of neural computation improves and ability to interface with nervous systems advances. The societal implications of computing's evolution demand attention alongside technical development. Algorithmic systems make consequential decisions about people's lives, often with limited transparency or accountability. Recommendation algorithms shape information environments, potentially polarizing society by showing people content confirming existing beliefs. Automation threatens employment in occupations from manufacturing to professional services, raising questions about economic security and purpose in an age of abundant computational labor. Surveillance technologies enable monitoring at scales previously impossible, threatening privacy and enabling authoritarian control. Addressing these challenges requires interdisciplinary collaboration, combining technical expertise with humanistic insight. Computer scientists must work with ethicists, social scientists, policymakers, and affected communities to understand computing's impacts and design systems aligned with human values. This is not merely a matter of technical design, but of governance, regulation, and social norms. Some advocate for technology shaped by democratic input rather than corporate imperatives. Others emphasize market mechanisms and individual choice. Finding balance between innovation and safety, between efficiency and equity, between convenience and privacy, will require ongoing negotiation as technology continues evolving. Education must adapt to prepare people for a computationally mediated world. Beyond teaching programming, education should develop critical thinking about algorithms, data, and automation. People need to understand how computational systems work, what their limitations are, and how to maintain agency in algorithmic environments. Digital literacy is not merely technical skill, but cultural competency for navigating modern life. Looking forward, computing's trajectory remains open. Continued hardware progress may come from new materials, three-dimensional chip architectures, or photonic computing using light instead of electrons. Software may evolve toward more robust, verifiable systems as critical infrastructure depends on reliability. Artificial intelligence might achieve human-level general intelligence or plateau at impressive but bounded capabilities. Quantum computing could revolutionize cryptography and simulation, or remain a specialized tool for narrow problems. Biological and artificial systems might merge, enhancing human cognition or creating new forms of intelligence. What seems certain is that computing will remain central to human civilization's trajectory. The technology has compressed and accelerated information processing, enabling coordination at scales from personal to planetary. It has connected people across geography, created new forms of expression and community, and amplified both human capability and human frailty. The challenge facing this generation and those following is not merely to advance computing's technical capabilities, but to ensure those capabilities serve human flourishing, that they expand opportunity rather than concentrate power, that they enhance understanding rather than manufacture confusion, that they bring people together rather than drive them apart. The history of computing is not just a story of machines becoming more powerful, though that is part of it. It is a story of human ingenuity applied to augmenting human thought, of societies adapting to new possibilities and grappling with unexpected consequences. From abacus to quantum computer, the thread running through this history is the desire to externalize and mechanize reasoning, to make thought visible and shareable and improvable. That project continues, and its ultimate implications for humanity remain to be written.